Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we are on the third day of a 3-day little mini historical aside on our journey through the book of Matthew to try to understand Herod Antipas, the Herod family, and what the very confusing, conflicted, dramatic political court life was that is going on in the background of the Gospels. By the time Matthew was written, the original audience would have known about a lot of this salacious stuff. They would have formulated strongly held opinions about Pontius Pilate, Tiberius, the Emperor Caligula. They would have formulated these same strongly held opinions about different members of the Herod family and who was right and who was wrong in the conflict between Antipas and Agrippa. And so because Matthew introduces these political characters into the narrative throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we have to know a little bit about this in order to position ourselves to understand and receive the document the way the original audience would. If we don't try to position ourselves that way when we read the Bible, then we read it poorly. And it ultimately is just going to come down to whatever some charismatic person with a microphone says you ought to think, because you're receiving it through that charismatic person with a microphone's lenses and not through the lenses of the original audience to whom it was written in the first place. So this energy that we're putting into this is an attempt to be an end run around my dumb opinions or other preferences that might be out there. And it is an attempt to position you and me and all of us as individuals to understand the Bible really well on its own terms. With that in mind, let's get back to talking about Herod Antipas, how things played out there, and what it means for how we read the book of Matthew. And when Emperor Crazy comes to power, there's this whole resetting of the court life and the little social alliances that have formed there in the Roman court. And everybody starts scrambling to curry favor from Caligula, including Antipas, who is like, I think I played my hand properly there. And he goes to Caligula and is like, hey, I think it would probably be best for stability here if I were just the king of everything from my father's kingdom in Judea and Galilee. But at the exact same moment, Antipas's nephew, Agrippa, this is the guy who comes up in the middle of the book of Acts, this Agrippa kid, sends an envoy to Caligula and is like, hey, Antipas is plotting an armed rebellion. He's got enough weapons to arm the better part of 100,000 men all stockpiled. And Caligula gets this message and he's like, hey, Antipas, as long as I've got you here, I got a pretty reliable source pointing out to me that maybe you're working on a rebellion and you have a bunch of weapons and stuff. And Antipas has to admit, I have all those weapons or whatever, but who knows why? And Caligula, who came to power by violence and intrigue and is therefore infinitely paranoid, is like, yeah, I can't have any of that going on. Antipas, you're fired, you're stripped of all of your titles, and you are exiled to the far reaches of Spain. You can take your wife with you if you want, or Herodias, you can stick around if you want. And she's like, no, I'll join my husband. So they have to forfeit all of their holdings and their property. And the trail of Herod Antipas and his wife Herodias goes cold in 39 AD, the larger part of a decade after the execution of Jesus. It goes cold in Spain, and that's the last we hear of them, and we assume that at some point in there they die. And that's why I'm unable to give you the exact date of his death, even though he's a very prominent character in history. So what that means is that for you and me to understand the Gospel of Matthew properly, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of people who would hear the name Herod Antipas and think about how they would receive any story or any anecdote that involves him. Are their attitudes going to be positive? Are they going to view him as a strong and legitimate leader? Or are they going to view him as a clown who did clown stuff and got clown rewards for his clown plays? I think it's overwhelmingly going to be the latter. We got to understand, the Herods were not that popular. People who had power granted to them by the Herod family tended to, at least in word, act like they liked the Herod family. But remember, Antipas's dad, Herod the Great, ordered a whole bunch of people to be slaughtered upon the day of his death so there would be some sense of grieving at his parting. That action alone says that even Herod the Great knew that nobody liked him and people viewed him and his family as interlopers who had no business governing. And indeed, that was the attitude toward the Herod family. You're not even really ethnically Jewish. Further, you're only part sort of tangentially Jewish, and You're more from a people group who's been an eternal rival of the Jewish people, who nips at the heels of God's chosen people. If the Jewish people had had the military option to reject the Herod family, they probably would have. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure people appreciated the building projects, but I'm also sure that Herod was constantly disappointed that he kept making awesome things and people kept being like, I don't know. You don't seem totally legit to me, and I don't like you. Maybe it's the same skepticism that Jesus encountered. That's a really cool thing and everything, but I'm kind of locked in on this political view of the world, this religious view of the world. I don't think I'm ever really going to buy into your deal. So when Herod Antipas comes up, even when he's given the title Herod the Tetrarch in Matthew 14, people who are reading this a couple decades later, maybe 3 or 4 decades later, are going to look at that and roll their eyes and be like, oh, you're taking me back to a miserable time where our stupid leaders did stupid things and created chaos with their stupid, lavish lifestyles and their stupid behavior that is antithetical to and even religiously illegal in our culture regarding how they did sex and marriage and intermarriage and incest. Gross. Antipas was the worst. I think that would have been the general sentiment toward the guy. And we get the impression from Luke where Jesus shows up in Jerusalem and the religious leaders come to him and pester him with a series of questions about, should you pay taxes to Caesar? And who's this lady who got widowed 7 times going to be married to? But the first question they ask him is, where do you get off doing this stuff, Jesus? Where do you get the authority to do this? And he bounces it back and he's like, well, where did John's baptism come from? Is that from God or is that from man? And they have to go and huddle up because they know if they say that there was nothing to John's baptism, they know the crowds are going to turn on them because, and this is what I'm driving at, John was so popular. His religious revival was such a big deal. John was more popular than Herod Antipas. It is not difficult for us to reestablish this. Of course, there were powerful people who didn't like John and did like Herod Antipas, but the sentiment of the crowd, the main people who'd be reading Matthew's document, seems to be the other way. John the Baptist, good. Jesus, still figuring it out. Herod Antipas, definitely not good. So then, when we read the book of Matthew and the first detailed interaction with Herod Antipas is this story about him stealing his brother's wife and doing this weird kind of incest-in-law business that he's doing and wrongly convicting John the Baptist because of his own paranoia and sexually exploiting some teenager who's doing some kind of sexy dance for him at this party, and then looking like a clown like Xerxes from the book of Esther, making big boastful promises about you get this or you get that, and then having to honor those promises in a way that isn't really politically expedient from him in order to save face. I mean, he follows the biblical model of the over-bloated, overly important joke of a king in keeping with the Old Testament expectations that everyone in the original audience of Matthew would have had. When all of that stuff goes down, the original audience is going to look at it and be like, John the Baptist looks even better in this story. He is a martyr. He was from God. He was wronged. And Herod Antipas is an outsider and an interloper and the son of an interloper and a political fraud who doesn't understand who we are. He tries to hold himself out as being pious and Jewish, but that's a fake. He's a liar, and there's one more story that confirms what we already thought about that joke of a guy. What it means is that this story with Herod the Great and John the Baptist and the dancing thing that we're going to unpack more in upcoming episodes, it means that this story was very cleverly selected and positioned by Matthew to have the desired effect of chasing a whole bunch of controversy and yuck, ratcheting tension, stuff that would cause people to question Jesus' legitimacy, but it's meant to bring him back to be like, well, do you like the king you have? Remember Herod Antipas? How do you feel about what he's doing? Does that look more kingdom-y? Or does this stuff that Jesus just said about the kingdom, does that look more kingdom-y? And Matthew knows he's going to score points here because of all the stuff we've talked about in our last 3 conversations about the Herod family, about Herod Antipas himself, and about the national mood regarding Rome and their weird ethnarch underlings and all of their stupid royal drama that serves no purpose other than to bring chaos and violence and the boot of Rome further down on the head of the common Jewish man and woman. Matthew is making a brilliant play here. It's really important for us to get this, or else we are not going to be positioned rightly to read Matthew the way it would have been originally received. But by doing this little extra bonus history homework, we are now able to track with Matthew's line of reasoning. We're able to better track with how he's trying to walk the original audience member who he has in mind through this process to get them to a point where they will see Jesus for what it is, ask self-critical questions of themselves and the authorities to which they have submitted, and to maybe reevaluate the whole big picture set of assumptions they have about life and death and God and religion and government and everything, and maybe, hopefully, in the mind of Matthew, come to the conclusion that John was from God, and that therefore Jesus was from God, and that therefore acknowledging Jesus as Messiah, Christ, and King, and being a part of his kingdom would be the smart thing to do, given the look of the religious, political, sociological landscape at the moment that they admittedly would have had a strong distaste for. Clever play by Matthew. We're better positioned to understand what he's doing there, and we are better positioned to go and break down the next chunk of text here in Matthew 14. Or at least I hope. At bare minimum, I had fun because I got to talk about a whole bunch of history stuff, and we got to game that out together, which is always a blast for me. So if the history episodes are not your thing, you are awesome. Thank you for still being here and hanging out with me. If the history episodes are your thing, well, you're in luck because we got a bunch more of this that we're going to have to unpack over the next few chapters as we put all of this business in its right historical context. TMBH Book of Matthew field note guides are ordered and inbound, and we are fixing to send those out to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast at any level. You're going to get one of those things. They are lovely. I think it's going to be fun. It'll be a cool way to just jot down notes and keep track of what is standing out to you as you process through this and get to a place where you get the Book of Matthew in your hip pocket. You see what I'm doing there? It's a book that fits in your hip pocket, where you can write down notes from what you're achieving and doing here, and then it goes in your hip pocket and you have it. It's a kind of a meta. It's okay. I think you're probably tracking with me, and I think it's pretty fun. So thanks again to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. Thanks again to all of you who don't as well. I'm just thrilled that you're here and we get to do this together. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.